Hey everybody, today we are debating whether or not an intellectual historical case can be made for the early Christian writings, and we are starting right now. Hey everybody, stoked to have you here. Very excited. So, for today's debate, we have a lot of, you could say, a lot of interesting historical questions, and we have a high level group of debaters. So, we will get that picture fixed in just a second. That's no problem. We're just lagging a bit, but we're going to be there in a second. For today's debate, want to say special thanks to our debaters for putting in a lot of preparation. Jonathan Sheffield and Dr. Robert Price. We are honored to have both of you here. So just right up front, want to say thanks for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having us.
Absolutely. And everybody, by the way, their links can be found in the description. So if you're like, man, I really enjoy hearing their message, or maybe you don't enjoy it, you're like, oh, I can't stand this, I want to tear it apart. Well, at least you can go to like straight to the source and get the strongest case straight from their link. And also, want to say thanks so much, Hunter, for being here to help moderate today. Very glad to have you. And basically, I will be keeping an eye on the live chat. If anybody has any questions, feel free to put at modern day debate and then who your question is for. And then we will be taking your questions, putting them in a list, and using them during the Q&A. So with that, I want to also mention, hey, if it's your first time here, feel free to hit that subscribe button as we are excited about a lot of future debates coming up. In fact, got a quick mention. We are very excited for this one. Does Easter have pagan origins? And that's going to be Mike Jones from Inspiring Philosophy against, I hope I pronounced this right. This is embarrassing. Singito of Belgae. So that's going to be this Sunday afternoon. Hopefully, we will see you there. So that's going to be, like I said, a very interesting and new type of debate for us. So, with that, we are now going to, I have to mention, this is a stick around because we're going to have our first giveaway ever. At the end of the debate, one of Dr. Robert Price's books is going to be given away, and it's going to be based on who Dr. Robert Price decides had the most interesting or challenging questions. So that is going to be a lot of fun. We're looking forward to it. And with that, we're going to jump right into the debate. So, last thing, I always forget this. Super chats. If you have a super chat, you can not only make a question, but you can make a comment that you'd like the one of the debaters to respond to during the Q&A, and it also goes to the top of the list throughout the debate or during the Q&A automatically. So with that, I am going to kick it over to Hunter. So Hunter basically is just going to let you all know what the format for today's debate is, and then Hunter is also going to get the debaters started. And given that Jonathan Sheffield is taking the affirmative, he of course will go first. And to Hunter, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for your help today.
Okay, awesome. Can you all hear me pretty clear?
Yes.
Awesome. So today the debate is actually going to be on, can an intellectual defense be made for the New Testament, featuring Jonathan A. Sheffield and Dr. Robert Price. So with Jonathan Sheffield being the affirmative, he's actually going to go first with a 15-minute opening. And whenever you're ready, we'll start the timer.
To open this discussion, I have selected specific statements and questions from Dr. Price's published work, Pre-Nicene New Testament, to help lay an objective framework for tonight's debate to formulate my response to. To that end, Dr. Price tells us that the question of the New Testament canon, which is to say the official list of writings or table of contents, is a vitally important one. It is obviously a vital matter to get clear about which writings are to wield authority over belief and conscience and which shall not. If the text of Scripture authorize everything else in Christian belief and practice, what is it that authenticates the biblical canon? In addition, there were books of the same type that did not finally make it into the canonical list. Who decided on the list and how did they decide? It is worth looking back at how came the Bible. When we have done that, we will be in a position to reevaluate other books that were not canonized. I would like to ponder for a second the question raised by Dr. Price. How came the Bible? Or more specifically, how did we get the writings of the New Testament? Now, to begin to answer such a question, don't we need to first establish its provenance? That is, its origins and history. And to undergo a study of its history is to identify those who came into physical possession of the written documents and were most acquainted with the publication to gain insight to its historical origins. From what we can document from Eusebius's histories, that would be the physical apostolic churches who are witnesses to these texts, to include the congregations in Africa, Armenia, Asia Minor, Bithynia, Cappadocia, Crete, Egypt, Galatia, Gaul, Greece, Italy, Libya, Spain, Palestine, Phoenicia, Pontus, Sicily, Syria, and Thrace. Now, up to this point, all that is known is that these written documents came into the possession of physical churches that were spread over a wide geographical area in the languages of Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Coptic, and other ancient languages at a time when there was no central authority in the churches. Since the focus of this inquiry is dealing specifically with the formation of a physical document that was published in the ancient world, such a task would require an author. Yet Dr. Price would have us believe that some of the authors of these records are unknown. Surely the written documents weren't created ex nihilo. So how do we go about historically authenticating authorship of a document published in the ancient world? Now, Augustine, a bishop of Hippo in North Africa, referring to his defense of the New Testament writing, argues that if we doubt its evidence, we may equally doubt that of any book, and asks, how do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? If you notice, Augustine's citation of an unbroken chain of evidence is an important legal term to test for the authenticity of records or evidence in any normal court of law.
Hey, Jonathan.
Yes.
Real quick, James, I don't know if you can hear it or not, but there is some weird sounds going on, and I paused the time for a second, but there's some weird sounds going on in the live chat, and I didn't know if we could do something about that real quick. I didn't want Jonathan to not be heard.
That's really weird. Let's see. We definitely don't have any sounds being played. So sorry about that. Oh wait, I think I might have just heard a sound.
Did you hear that?
Did you?
Nope, it's not me.
No, I mean like, did you hear it?
Yes, I did. I unmuted the YouTube live stream, and you can hear it.
Yeah, I just got an email from someone that said there's continuous corny sound effects are constantly playing.
That's strange. I don't hear it. Hopefully, I deleted the alert box, but it was already on mute. So hopefully that was maybe it. Oh.
Nope, it's still happening. I can hear it.
No sounds being played. I honestly, like, I know, I just heard like a spring, like something like... Oh, hold on, that might be what it is. Okay, that is so embarrassing. It's actually, it's the, hold on, I think I can do this. So sorry about that. This is totally embarrassing, you guys. This is all my fault.
And can we start over?
Yes, we can, and I'm so sorry.
So I'll actually, sorry about that. So I'll actually start the timer over for 15 minutes, and that way everybody can actually hear what you're saying. Sorry about that, guys.
I am sincerely sorry about that. I think this should do it. Yeah, that's definitely okay. I hear that.
Is somebody simultaneously playing a Warner Brothers cartoon?
Definitely. I think it's one of our media sources, and is it still there, Hunter?
Let me check. Yep, still happening.
Okay, I think I got. Got it. I think that should do it.
All right, let me actually
What's that?
let me check it. All right, I'm not hearing it. I think okay, it is gone. So we are good to go. All right, so let's try that again one more time, Jonathan. When you're ready, you go right ahead. Okay.
All right, let me give me 1 second.
Yeah.
All right, I just want to grab a little water.
Thanks for your patience, everybody.
No problem. All righty. To open this discussion, I have selected specific statements and questions from Dr. Price's published work, The Pre-Nicene New Testament, to help lay an objective framework for tonight's debate to formulate my response to. To that end, Dr. Price tells us that the question of the New Testament canon, which is, say, the official list of writings or table of contents, is a vitally important one. It is obviously a vital matter to get clear about which writings are to wield authority over belief and conscience, and which shall not. If the texts of Scripture authorize everything else in Christian belief and practice, what is it that authenticates the biblical canon? In addition, there were books of the same type that did not finally make it into the canonical list. Who decided on the list, and how did they decide? It is worth looking back at how came the Bible. When we have done that, we will be in a position to reevaluate other books that were not canonized. I would like to ponder for a second the question raised by Dr. Price: how came the Bible? Or more specifically, how did we get the writings of the New Testament? To begin to answer such a question, don't we need to first establish its provenance, that is, its origins in history? And to undergo a study of its history is to identify those who came into physical possession of the written documents and were most acquainted with the publication to gain insight to its historical origins. From what we can document from Eusebius's histories, that would be the physical apostolic churches who are witnesses to these texts, to include the congregations in Africa, Armenia, Asia Minor, Bithynia, Cappadocia, Sicilia, Crete, Egypt, Galatia, Gaul, Greece, Italy, Libya, Spain, Palestine, Phoenicia, Pontus, Sicily, Syria, and Thrace. Now, up to this point, all that is known is that these written documents came into the possession of physical churches and were spread over a wide geographical area in the languages of Greek, Latin, Aramaic, Coptic, and other ancient languages, at a time when there was no central authority in the churches. Since the focus of this inquiry is dealing specifically with the formation of a physical document that was published in the ancient world, such a task would require an author. Yet Dr. Price would have us believe that some of the authors of these records are unknown. Surely the written documents weren't created ex nihilo. So how do we go about historically authenticating authorship of a document published in the ancient world? Augustine, a bishop of Hippo in North Africa, referring to his defense of the New Testament writings, argues that if we doubt its existence, we may equally doubt that of any book, and ask, how do we know the authorship of the works of Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, Varro, and other similar writers, but by the unbroken chain of evidence? If you notice, Augustine's citation of an unbroken chain of evidence is an important legal term to test for the authenticity of records or evidence in any normal court of law. In legal context, it refers to the chronological documentation or paper trail that records the sequence of custody, control, and transfer of physical evidence. Now, Augustine's statement demonstrates that this legal principle was understood in the ancient world and not just a modern concept. Augustine further contends, the utter overthrow of all literature will follow, and there will be an end to all books handed down from the past, if what is supported by such strong popular belief and established by the uniform testimony of so many men and so many times, is brought into suspicion that it is not allowed to have the credit and the authority of common history. Augustine further demonstrates that the ruling is based on the testimony of many independent witnesses that agree, which would be conclusive in any normal court of law. And when Augustine speaks to the credit and authority of common history, it conveys basically the same sentiment as when Dr. Richard Carrier, who holds a PhD in ancient history, states that the Aeneid was written in a period of history that is exceptionally well documented. This allows us to understand in good detail the context of the Aeneid's formation. For we know the author of the Aeneid, Virgil, and a great deal of information about him. Virgil published his myth, the Aeneid, around the beginning of the 1st century. Given this, we should also be able to find at least some of the names of the actual authors of the New Testament writings, and also be able to trace when and where the commonly received texts of the apostolic churches were written, as Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Gaius during the late 2nd century were able to name some of the authors and provide details for the formation of the so-called Gnostic texts, to include such texts as Marcion's, Valentius, and Basilides. To that aim, if our aim is to truly understand how came the Bible and what authenticates the biblical canon as we know it against the textual claims of the Gnostics, then we should allow the record to speak for itself, from those who wrote specifically on the issue to give Dr. Price the answers he is looking for. To do this, it is important first to give context to the argument that ensued during the 2nd century that elicited a legal response from such fathers as Irenaeus of Lyons and Tertullian of North Africa in defending the commonly received texts of the apostolic churches. For the debate of the 2nd century was for the original writings of the apostles, that is, the canon. As Irenaeus tells us in his 3rd book against the heresies, the followers of Valentius bring forward their own compositions and boast they have more gospels than really exist, and have entitled their recent composition the Gospel of Truth, though it agrees in nothing with the Gospels of the Apostles. Tertullian in North Africa corroborates the same point in his 4th book against Marcion, affirming, I say that my Gospel is the true one, Marcion's that his is. I affirm that Marcion's Gospel is adulterated, Marcion's that mine is. But then Tertullian asks, now what is it to settle this point for us? But before we allow Irenaeus and Tertullian to share their testimony on this matter, let us take a closer look at the case of Marcion for 2 specific reasons. First, the case of Marcion allows us to demonstrate the objective criteria to rule on textual matters of this kind. And second, it provides us insight into Dr. Price's Christ myth theory, since Dr. Price asserts that the history of a distinctly Christian scriptural canon begins with Marcion of Pontus around 140 AD. For Dr. Price correctly identifies in his book that Marcion believed Jesus had no physical birth, but had appeared out of the heaven one day in a body that seemed to be that of a 30-year-old, complete with a misleading belly button, although not human at all, rather a celestial being. The foundation for this view is based on Marcion's text, which Marcion claimed was the original writings of Paul. Tertullian tells us in his writings that Marcion argued in his antithesis that the Gospel of Luke and the letters of Paul were interpolated by the defenders of Judaism for theological reasons to form the type of Christ to conform to Catholic teaching. Now, if Marcion is right, then Dr. Price's, it does open up the possibility for Dr. Price's theories. But in response to those textual claims, Irenaeus opens up his 3rd book against the heresies, identifying what writings were handed down, which constitutes a physical transfer of the text to the apostolic churches, which are a physical institution, from the apostles, which identifies the source. To bear record to this testimony, Irenaeus tells us that the tradition of the apostles, that is, the canonical gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that he had just referenced in his opening arguments, is made clear in all the world and can be seen in every church by those who wish to behold the truth. This statement from Irenaeus provides verifiable, independent attestation of different churches across a wide geographical area in many languages that witness to the same writings, naming the same authors. To authenticate the independent testimony, Irenaeus affirms we can enumerate those who were established by the apostles as bishops in the churches, and their successors down to our time, which establishes the transfer, control, and mechanism for the writings back to the apostles, demonstrating an unbroken chain of custody for their texts. To that end, Irenaeus confirms that this was the function of the apostolic polity when he writes, "We appeal again to that tradition which has come down from the apostles and is guarded by the succession of elders in the churches." Tertullian, on the opposite side of the Roman Empire in North Africa, corroborates Irenaeus' testimony and provides empirical verification to the same system in his response to Marcion. For Tertullian approaches the claims of Marcion by subjecting his version of Luke objectively against the texts that have come down in the official churches of Paul. Tertullian appeals to the textual witnesses in the churches of Corinth, Galatia, Philippians, Thessalonica, Ephesus, and Rome for comparison. And to further emphasize his legal arguments against Marcion, Tertullian writes, we also have St. John's foster churches. For although Marcion rejects his apocalypse, the order of the bishops thereof, when traced up to their origin, will yet rest on John as their author. This statement further demonstrates the unbroken chain of evidence by many independent witnesses for the text of Revelation back to the apostles. By way of comparison, Tertullian tells us that Marcion's gospel is not known to most people. In other words, Marcion's text was not received by the independent churches of Paul, which deems the text apocryphal. This situation is no different than when Jerome went to the Jewish church to translate the Hebrew Bible into Latin and did not find the Apocrypha in the Jewish canon, for it was not received amongst the Jewish churches. Serapion, a bishop in Antioch, who wrote a book concerning the so-called Gospel of Peter, confirms the same point and tells us, for our part, brethren, we receive both Peter and the other apostles as Christ. But the writings which falsely bear their names we reject, as men of experience, knowing that such was not handed down to us. Remember, the Gnostic texts were all different. Testimony of this kind would not hold up in any court. Yet when we look at the independent apostolic churches in Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic that can easily establish a legal chain of custody back to the apostles through the succession of bishops, they basically come up with the same four gospels, naming the same authors, the Acts, the 14 letters of Paul, 1 John, 1 Peter, and James. Independent witnesses that basically agree, where no collusion can be established, would be decisive in any normal court of law. Now, if Dr. Price rejects the application, which explains how he got the writings of the New Testament, how does Dr. Price document the historical mechanism for how it was done after 140 AD? And here I turn over it to Dr. Price.
Okay, awesome. Dr. Price, when you're ready.
Okay. There's a big problem here in that all of these people, these Tertullian and various others, are writing so far after any likely origin date for any of these documents, that they're really not independent or authoritative witnesses. They're all just sort of cleaving to the party line established by Christian apologists and polemicists who constructed the notion of the apostolic succession of bishops, um, and the witness of the elders, whoever they were, few if any are ever named. And it's like the names to whom the New Testament books are ascribed are there's nothing to connect most of them with any apostle. Not that we even know who any apostles were, or if the office of apostle as defined in the church went back that far. Even the Gospels that give lists of disciples don't completely agree. Harmonists go to work saying, well, really, Thaddeus and Judas, not Iscariot, and Lebbaeus and these guys, they're different names of the same guy. Nathaniel and Bartholomew, they must have been the same guy. This is just harmonizing inconsistencies. If you look at the gospel authorship ascriptions, they don't tell you anything. Church tradition from over 100 years later tries to identify these people, but Mark, this was the most common name in the Roman Empire. It's like saying the Gospel of Joe, the Gospel of Bill. There's nothing distinctive about that name. Luke was the second most common male name in the Roman Empire. And Matthew seems to me to be, I mean, even if it was written by someone named Matthew, and we don't know that because there are no names given in the gospel texts, as there are by contrast with the various epistles. Whether Paul wrote them or not, at least the text claims to be by Paul. That's not the case in the gospels. It appears that the various names were tacked on them when various churches had collected more than one gospel, and so they needed to be able to say which one they were reading from on a Sunday. At first, when each had presumably one gospel, they would say, now we're reading from the gospel. But once you had a couple of them or more, which gospel you're talking about? Okay, kata Mark, according to Mark, which doesn't even mean that he's supposed to have written it. It's just that version of it. But who was Mark? Certainly was not an apostle. Nobody ever thought he was. Same thing with Luke. So what you had Papias and Irenaeus doing in the 2nd century was saying, okay, Batman didn't write it, but maybe Robin did. These sidekicks of the apostles must have written down what their apostolic master said. That is pure supposition. In fact, two of them whose names match names in the gospel lists of apostles, John and Matthew, they almost cannot be written by the gospel characters of those names. For instance, in Matthew, we have a rewrite of Mark, and one revealing example here is that Mark has a story of the calling to discipleship of the tax collector Levi. Then he has a list of disciples in which Levi does not appear, but a Matthew does. But in the Gospel of Matthew, it's rewritten so that the story of Levi's calling is still there, word for word practically, except the name has been changed to Matthew. And in his version of the list of disciples, we now read of a Matthew the tax collector. Mark hadn't said that Matthew was a tax collector. He had said Levi was, but nobody ever says in the Gospels that Levi and Matthew were two names for the same man. Now, if the evangelist, quote unquote, Matthew, is the author of this, why did he take somebody else's conversion story and put his name on it. That's just a special example of a larger question. If Matthew was a disciple and Mark was not, why is Matthew an expansion and a redaction of the Gospel of Mark instead of the ostensible eyewitness author's own recollections? That alone is enough to rule it out. So why was the name Matthew chosen? Well, it's probably a pun on one of that evangelist's favorite words, to disciple or to be a disciple, and that in Greek, disciple is a mathetes. I don't think that's a coincidence. As to Luke, many scholars think that Marcion's gospel was closer to the original, and that the features of style and thematic consistency one finds in our canonical Gospel of Luke is concentrated in the areas Marcion accepted in his gospel. The stuff that he claimed were interpolations probably were, because they do not bear the same stylistic marks and so forth. For instance, it's common knowledge that the nativity stories in Luke's gospel are stylistically different. They're imitation Septuagintal Greek with a possible Aramaic substratum, again stylistically, that you don't find in the rest of Luke. The Gospel of John seems to claim to be a product of an eyewitness, but both of the passages in which those claims are made, where, he who saw this has attested to it, etc. One is in chapter 19 with the crucifixion, in what seems to me plainly an interpolation, where it says that the Roman soldiers determined that Jesus was already dead, and therefore they didn't break his legs to hasten his death. And then immediately we're told to ascertain whether Jesus was dead or not. One of them stabbed him in the side. Wait a minute, I thought we already knew they knew he was dead. This is an inconsistency, and it looks like an interpolation for that reason by itself. And that is the verse in which it says, he who saw this bears witness so that you too may believe. So I think there is serious doubt as to whether that was original to the text. Likewise, at the end of chapter 21, we know that his testimony is true. Chapter 21 is obviously an appendix added to the Gospel of John. The Gospel ends at the end of 20, and then suddenly it picks up with the Sea of Tiberias business and all that, and then the original ending, the last verse of chapter 20, has been paraphrased as the last verse of chapter 21, a common giveaway of interpolation. Now, so it seems to me we don't even have a claim, and in John, so-called, of eyewitness authority. We certainly don't have one in any of the synoptic gospels. The names are just editorial conventions. We don't know even who they're supposed to refer to, as witness the age-long debate as to whether the author of the gospel was the same as the John who wrote Revelation. Some people said it was, some people said it wasn't. So it was never certain. There are reasons I can go into if we have time, serious reasons to deny the Pauline authorship of 6 of the 13 epistles attributed to Paul. Of course, Hebrew is the so-called 14th, and it doesn't even have a name on it. But there are even scholars, there were in the 19th century, who came up with pretty surprising arguments that none of the epistles attributed to Paul were by him. There was a Paul, but he was a big name that people used to authenticate their own works. We don't know, but that's my point. There's room for debate on all of this. We can't say who these people were with any certainty. As for the as like Second Peter, that wasn't even in these original lists by Irenaeus and Tertullian. That cannot have been written by the historical Simon Peter, because it assumes that Paul's epistles have been collected into a canon and that everybody knows their scripture. That's grossly anachronistic, and there's more and more about Second Peter. Jerome realized that the Epistle of James couldn't have been written by James the Just in Jerusalem, the so-called brother of Jesus, that somebody must have written it in his name, because a zealous, xenophobic Jewish Christian leader, as James is purported to have been, couldn't possibly have the skill in Greek or the acquaintance with Stoic philosophy that permeate the Epistle of James. As to whether there is a chain of transmission, that really means nothing in the ancient world, because people played a game of trying to authenticate it this way, as not too much later in history Muslims did with the Hadith of Muhammad. When the Quran didn't say something they wanted Muhammad to have said, they came up with extra canonical sayings and said, well, I got this from Ibn so-and-so, who got it from Abdullah al-Hazred, who got it from Osama bin Laden, and a whole long catalog of names. And they got it from Abu Bakr, who got it from the Prophet. This even in the ancient world was known to be a fiction. The long priestly genealogies of chronicles, for example, are almost certainly just bogus credential lists. The idea of apostolic succession, anybody could claim this, and everybody did. Valentinus, the greatest of the Gnostics, claimed that he was merely passing on what he learned from Theodotus, a disciple of Paul. So he had good Pauline teachings. Or Basilides said, well, I'm just giving you the teaching of Peter, which I got from his disciple Glaucius. Like, why do we dismiss these rather than, and just blithely accept the ascriptions given by Eusebius and Irenaeus and so forth? In fact, Eusebius practically admits that authorship claims were rejected or accepted based on the perceived orthodoxy of the content. There's a Gospel of Thomas, but it's got to be a forgery because we don't like what it said. The real Thomas would never have said. So he didn't. Gospel of Peter. Oh, well, Peter wouldn't have said that stuff. It's docetic. So he didn't. Well, I don't think Thomas or Peter actually said it either, but I think the same questions have to be raised about the usual Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Paul, Peter, etc. The whole thing is an attempt to win an argument with rivals whose voices we haven't been able to hear until 1945, when the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered, and they have authorship ascriptions too. Mary Magdalene wrote this one. James, the brother of Jesus, wrote that one. Bartholomew wrote this. Nobody takes that seriously, but I don't see how those authorship ascriptions are any more reliable than the ones in the canon. As to who decided what would be in the canon, that really finally came about in, I guess, about 3 different North African synods in the 3rd or 4th century. There's no way they were in a position to know who had written these things. The notion that these texts were safeguarded and passed on by the Pauline churches, there's nothing to indicate that anybody associated with these churches, which are precious few as far as we know, had ever read any of these things. You can read books about the apostolic fathers and their doctrine of grace and all that, and they always say, what a catastrophic declension from the apostles to this stuff. Well, is that possibly because the 2nd century writers did not have access to these materials because they hadn't been written yet? I think the Gospels were written shortly before Irenaeus. There are no verifiable quotations from any of them, though there are occasional sayings that sound
Huh.
kind of like it. So it seems to me they're really this whole argument is too eager to accept tradition. Apologists always say, well, you can't absolutely disprove what we learned in Sunday school, so we can go on assuming that it is true. No, we can't. You can't magically sprinkle fairy dust over
And Robert Price, that's time.
Gnosticism and make it into fideism. Go ahead, sir.
That's time. So what we're gonna do next, Jonathan, with your 10-minute rebuttal when you're ready.
Okay. As I start going into more of my second response, I do want to just answer a couple questions that Dr. Price raised. First, when we look at the textual claims of the Valentians and Marcion in their claims to succession, what we find within the text of Valentius, we find in the text of Marcionus, what we see in the text of Basilides, and even Nag Hammadi, they are all different. Now we have the churches in Antioch, in Jerusalem, in Alexandria, both the Greek and the Coptic. You have the Church of Rome, you have the churches of Asia Minor coming up with the same testimony, basically coming up with the same testimony for most of the books. In regards to Dr. Price's reference to Bukhari, who used an objective standard in his day to
Who?
find...
I'm sorry. Who? What's the name there?
Oh, Bukhari. But Bukhari was the scholar who set about to collect the sayings of Muhammad.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Okay, 200 years after his death, and he used a similar system to what was known in the ancient world to collect the sayings of Muhammad. But unlike Bukhari, we actually have thousands of independent, different churches across a wide geographical area coming up with basically the same testimony, whereas Bukhari was just one man. Now, I do want to go through a little bit of Dr. Price's theory, because remember, Dr. Price suggested that the history of a distinctly Christian scriptural canon begins with Marcion of Pontus in Asia Minor, traditionally dated around 140 AD. Now, according to that premise, the formation of most of the writings of the New Testament canon as we know it today, and its distribution throughout the Roman Empire, would have had to have been completed between the period of 150 AD and 180 AD. Since Dr. Price documents in his book that Irenaeus, whose writings are dated around 180, has already identified the writings of the four Gospels, Pauline epistles, Acts, 1 Peter, 1 John, another epistle of John, Jude, and Revelation. Remember, Irenaeus, who is a witness to the textual tradition in Asia Minor, Gaul, and Rome, provides at least empirical verifications for the writings in those areas by 180 AD, and actually appeals to the churches in Asia Minor as corroborating witnesses for his testimony. And Tertullian, writing shortly after Irenaeus, around 190 to 200 AD, who Dr. Price states is a follower of Irenaeus, even though there is no ancient documentation to support that assertion, which just amounts to mere speculation, places basically the same writings in the apostolic churches of Africa, which he is a witness to, the Greek churches, Asia Minor, and Rome. Therefore, if Dr. Price is going to maintain the hypothesis that the formation, translation, and distribution of the New Testament canon as we know it was completed in the span of approximately 30 to 40 years, then by what natural mechanism did these texts find their way into all these independent apostolic churches that were of different theological positions and were spread over a vast geographical area in the languages of Greek, Latin, Aramaic, and Coptic without any central authority? Because remember, if the epicenter of Christianity wasn't the apostles, then someone had to do it. And to do this, let's understand a little more about Dr. Price's theory on the formation of the canon. Now, in an attempt to deal with the textual claims of Marcion, Dr. Price tells us that the Catholic Church sought to co-opt Marcionism late in the 2nd century by adding material to the Pauline text and to Luke. And to help clarify Dr. Price's statement, he's asserting that the apostolic churches took control of Marcion's text under its domain to form the basis of the development of a future canon. Yet Dr. Price's theory is missing a mechanism like an Uthman, the third caliph who made a revision of the Quran and burned the other copies for the Muslim communities. Now, the churches of Antioch, Alexandria, Rome, Asia Minor, and others were all independent of each other. There was no central church or authority like an Uthman governing the churches to organize such an event, especially in the 2nd century. And another point I want to bring up is that Dr. Price, he doesn't name the Catholic churches involved in this process, where this occurred, or even provided a letter speaking to this so-called historical event. We have many letters by the bishops. We know of many of the ecumenical council, but we have nothing for this. Yet we can document bishops in Rome in around 116 AD who tried to assert supremacy and influence over other churches on the observance of Easter very early in the 2nd century, which went largely ignored and led Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, to travel all the way to Rome to actually deal with the issue, which led to a response by Incentitus, the 10th Bishop of Rome. And we have the letters and writings documenting this entire event, but no mention of what Dr. Price is asserting. Further on, Dr. Price tells us that the Catholic bishops decided to retain the Jewish Bible and to add a new set of scriptures onto it. So they took over the Pauline corpus, added the pastorals, and interpolated the others to bring them in accord with the Catholic teaching. Now, once again, Dr. Price doesn't name any of the bishops that were involved in this process. Was it Pius I? Was it St. Anstitus, who were appointed to the episcopate in Rome during this time? Or Eros, the Theophilus, the bishops of Antioch that was overseeing the church over there? To this end, this process was to bring the scriptures in accord with the Catholic teaching. Well, what was Catholic teaching? The Nicene Creed and the Creed of Constantinople wasn't established until the 4th century. Now, Dr. Price continues by telling us that Marcion's gospel became our gospel of Luke by adding chapters 1 through 3, which includes the birth narrative, the narrative, Nazareth synagogue sermon, the prodigal son, and others. And in addition, to balance and dilute Luke, they added Matthew, Mark, and John. Dr. Price still needs to identify and document the author responsible for the creation of these passages and texts, because they surely weren't created ex nihilo. Now, why some of this information may elude Dr. Price, we can historically document the author of the Shepherd of Hermas, who was a real historical person who wrote the Shepherd, a document that we are well acquainted with in history. And it was done in the city of Rome, and we know that his brother was Pius, who was the Bishop of Rome. So when we look at all this evidence, we are able to ascertain different textual compositions because we have common history and writings that speak of such events. Now, to be fair to Dr. Price, he does say towards the end of his foreword that who are these unknown clerics of the church that basically came up with our spiritual menu? And the question is, when he brings up the local councils in Carthage, it's important to give just a little context to that, because Carthage in 419 AD was actually responding to Pope Boniface, who had rejected the authorship of John of Revelation, as well as There were some other complaints about it again. But if we look at the statement that they said in Canon 24 in 419, they actually say, let this be sent to our brother and fellow bishop and other bishops of that part, that they may confirm this canon. For these are the things which we have received from our fathers to be read in church. There's no decree there. And even Dr. Price recognizes in his own work that there was no decree on the canon until the Council of Trent in the 1500s. With that, I turn over my time to Dr. Price.
These people are all way too late. We don't know what basis they had. Irenaeus constantly throughout his Against Heresies attributes anything, including the brand of toothpaste you should use, to the elders in the Eastern churches. We don't know who the heck he was talking about. And the same thing, you have the same problem you're suggesting I have. How did all the different churches get the canon if it wasn't through some agency? Did Santa push drop the canon down the chimney on one Christmas Eve? You just have to, well, in all probability, it seems to me that the one who put the Christian canon, the Catholic canon together, was Polycarp. And he and his disciple Irenaeus probably put this together. They were both enemies of Marcionism. As to Tertullian, everybody agrees, all patristic scholars agree, that he based some of his anti-heretical documents on the writings of Irenaeus. He was a big fan of Irenaeus, and as was Justin Martyr. This chain, as I say, this chain of possession, that's simply posited and unverifiable. And just like the isnads, the chains of attestation for the hadith were, and loads of people came up with those just to authenticate what they had written. There simply is no, like, the bishops who had custody, who? Like, we don't know. We know of a few names of later bishops, but we know nothing about them anymore. Than we do about the apostles. And I would suggest you might want to read Knox's Marcion in the New Testament, which sets forth the notion of the importance of Marcion and coming up with his canon, the Apostolicon and the Evangel, and also what's his name? I'm losing it. Walter Bauer's Orthodoxy and Heresy in Early Christianity, who talks about how the Roman Church did send out its tendrils in the 2nd century to outwit and outfox all the so-called heretical views, and also the guy that's in the Bible Museum, David Trobisch. His book, the first edition of the New Testament, goes into the role of Polycarp as the what Bultmann called the ecclesiastical redactor. You're captive to this apologetic party line. I remember seeing an authorized biography of Pat Robertson. That's the last thing I'm going to read to find out about Pat Robertson. You know it's all spin. And the Eusebius is notorious as a spin doctor who was not above making texts up and so on. It just seems to me that this is you just accepting the institutional apologetic and ignoring the evidence in the text that they cannot have stemmed from any sort of eyewitnesses. They're not that kind of literature. They're often rewritten versions of Old Testament stories. Some Mark seems to have used the Odyssey. You can't just sweep the stuff out of the way. In fact, the earliest Paulinists we know of were the Marcionites and the Gnostics. We have no other attestation that there ever were Pauline churches in Corinth, Thessalonica, Rome, etc., because people are just in a kind of literalistic, credulous way, assuming that, well, whatever the Bible or the church fathers say must be inerrant truth, when there is no reason to think it. That's complete. Like, you have to critically evaluate what is said. You can't take this everything at face value. That's what pre-scientific history did, but there's been all sorts of pseudepigraphical work among the Stoics, Jewish writers. This was the common thing, and there are just damning criticism of apostolic authorship and any sort of direct transmission. There, in Irenaeus and Tertullian, you do have a kind of parallel to the Apostles' Creed that gives these basic tenets of what Christianity was at the time. You don't have to wait till Nicaea and Constantinople to have an emerging orthodoxy. And all these people like, what's his name in the guy you mentioned that talked about the Gospel of Peter, Bishop Serapion. Serapion. He said, well, Peter couldn't have written this because it sounds docetic. That's the way it is with all these authorship claims. If you like what the books say, it must have been an apostle. If you don't, it must be a heretical forgery, to use the term Eusebius does. It's just that some of this is possible. But as F.C. Bauer said, the historian wants to know, well, anything is possible, but the historian wants to know what is probable. And often you can't even tell that. It's easy to see what motivations led to these claims of authorship, just like claims of episcopal primacy. Galatians said, well, Peter was the guy that taught our bishops, and Rome said, oh, yeah, I'll see your Peter and raise you Paul. There's no evidence that these people were associated with it. It's just they're selling the same bill of goods, which I don't see how it reflects on what these documents teach. I don't see why they can't just be allowed to speak for themselves. Like, you don't need to know who wrote the Sermon on the Mount to see the spiritual truth of it. And it just seems to me this is all an authority game, and one based on dubious, unverifiable claims. I must have gone beyond my allotted minutes there.
Actually, you're fine. So if, Jonathan, you wanted to go with a 5-minute response, your time whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, thank you for your comments, Dr. Price. A couple of quick points to make. Justin Martyr was actually before Irenaeus, so I'm not sure how much of a fan he may have been.
No, I'm sorry. It's just the other way around. It's Irenaeus who made use of the syntagma of Justin Martyr. Sorry, that's right.
Oh, no, it's all good. I thought we could have a quick laugh on that one real quick. But we still have to look at these claims to authorship, because when we look at the Gnostic sects, they were all different. And they all had similar claims that they all went back to the apostles. But when we look at the Gnostics, and Irenaeus makes this point that the truth is different in each one of these groups. And all their texts are different too. The claims of Marcion, the claims of Valentius, they had two different texts that they were using.
Of what? You mean different manuscripts of the same book, or different?
Yeah, the Gospel of Truth is different than the text of Marcion. So,
well, Matthew is very different from Luke, and John is very different from any of the others.
Dr. Price, Yeah, if you could, Jonathan has a 5 minute response real quick. If you could just let him finish real quick,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can have a 5 minute response as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the question we got to ask is, how do we have all these independent witnesses? I mean, when we're talking about the Church of Antioch, Church of Alexandria, and obviously there was disagreement over a lot of issues. But when we objectively look at these physical churches who have possession of these texts, they had to come from somewhere. They basically come up with the same four gospels, naming the same author. I mean, and this is in Greek, Latin, Coptic, Aramaic, and other ancient languages. They come up with Acts, the letters of Paul, 1 John, 1 Peter. And yes, there were discussions about other texts, but they're in basic agreement. And if we apply legal principles to that, just like in any other normal court of law, where there is basic agreement amongst the independent witnesses and no collusion could be showed, that would be conclusive in any normal court of law. And, when we speak of the text, we have to speak of the churches, because where did these churches come from if the epicenter of Christianity wasn't, if the apostles weren't the epicenter? We have churches all over all over the Roman Empire coming up with basically the same testimony. And when we apply that to the standard of the Gnostics did not, they were all disagreeing with each other. And in any court, witnesses that disagreed like that would not be found verifiable at all. In regards to the claim of Polycarp organizing the text, once again, he's only one bishop in Smyrna. And as we've already showed, there's already been a dispute over the date of Easter. How would the West accept anything that he had to say when there was already a disruption over on the date of when they were going to observe Easter? So to say he had any power to conform the Church of Rome or the Church of North Africa, there's just no evidence for it. They're already in disagreements over this. And to say that he responded to Marcion, I believe Polycarp was actually earlier than Marcion. So
They met in Rome.
was that Valentius that he met in Rome, or Marcion?
No, I believe it was Marcion.
Oh, okay.
Marcion said, "Do you recognize me as bishop or whatever?" He said, "Oh, I recognize the firstborn of Satan."
Okay.
And so he wrote he hated Marcion and so on.
Okay. But once again, we have no documentation that, because it would require many different churches, and as we know, the Peshitta does not have Revelation and James. So they weren't forced to accept anything. Is my time up, Hunter, or?
You still have 20 seconds if you want to just wrap it up with any following conclusions.
Well, I'd just like to finish off by saying, when we look at Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is normally the correct one. How else do we explain that all these independent churches basically come to the same agreement? The variances show gives further weight to their independent testimony.
So you're saying that the 12 apostles came up with a canonical New Testament, and each one of them gave the list and the set of writings to the bishops and so forth. I mean, there must have been some central authority even on your view. It's not like, how did they happen to even possess the same bunch of documents if there weren't some central authority who, like later on, we know that the list of Polycarp was enforced by Athanasius in his Easter letter of 365 AD, when he said, "Okay, from now on, these are the only books we're going to use for the New Testament." And he lists our 27, though apparently Polycarp's version already had that. It was just that there was no unanimity. People like were using the Shepherd of Hermas and the Gospel according to the Hebrews and various other things. Well, no more. But where did he get the list? He apparently, again, it's really important to read the book by David Trobisch, the first edition of the New Testament. It's these bishops and so forth are not independent witnesses. I mean, did they all just happen to come up with their theology differently? They're not independent. They're local franchises of a big institution. Like every McDonald's doesn't have its own menu. They're told, here's what you're going to sell, and it's you're sort of ripping out any foundation under the institution. It's not like it just came out of nowhere. They circulated these documents. That's pretty clear. I mean, as it says in Colossians, for instance. Why don't you read the one I sent to Laodicea, and you read the one you send a copy of this to them? People circulated the things for sure. But I don't think you needed to. It's not like they sent a finished copy, as Constantine did hundreds of years later. They didn't need to, as long as they had. And how come the Nag Hammadi texts were secreted away in jars? Well, because the monks of St. Pachomius got the encyclical from Athanasius, and they knew that whoever brought that letter to them would be coming back to check their library. And so rather than burn the Gnostic texts, they just stuck them away in a cave. So there were enforcers and so forth that did this. And it's I just think your place in the formation of the canon, it just anachronistically, if for no other reason. I mean, the fact that the gospel writers feel free to redact and rewrite one another, they obviously didn't think of the works they used as binding authorities. Sources of inspiration, yes, but they felt free to change it. And I just don't. I think you're just accepting an institutional party line drawn up by later, sometime fabricators, propagandists like Eusebius.
Oh, is this
Okay,
time?
and with that, yes, that's fine if that's what he has left to say. So right now we're actually going to go into the cross-examination. So Jonathan, feel free to ask Dr. Robert Price the questions you want, and then when you're done with the 5 minutes with Dr. Robert Price, you can go and ask Jonathan your questions, and just whenever you're ready.
Okay. The first question I have for you, Dr. Price, is that Luke, in the book of Acts, has Paul meeting with Gallio, which was the brother of Seneca in Corinth. Now, obviously, the discovery of the inscription at Delphi enables to date fairly accurately Gallio's proconsulship. How would an author know that, unless Luke was there, placing the date of the origin of Acts closer to 57 or 62, that you place after 140 AD?
Well, for one thing, it's not like he was from another planet. There were ancient novels from the first and second century BC to first and second century AD, often mention known governors and so forth, and have their fictional heroes appear before them. That's not like any proof of the guy being present at the time. And as you say, Gallio was the brother of a celebrity, so it's not too unlikely he would be known. But there are, for instance, Harnack said that there's no explicit mention of the fall of Jerusalem in Acts. There's no mention of the martyrdom of Paul in Acts, and I beg to differ. The Olivet Discourse in Luke has this. He says that not when you see the abomination of desolation, where it ought not to be. Get the heck out of there. That's what Mark and Matthew have, but Luke has, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, etc., well, that's 70 AD. These predictions that the temple is going to be destroyed within a generation, certainly that's written by somebody who knew the temple had fallen then. The thing with Paul's death, Luke intimates that a number of times when Agabus says, he takes the belt, binds himself with it, and says, you know, the guy that's wearing this belt is going to lose his life. And Paul speaks to the Ephesian elders, I know you're never going to see my face again, and so on. It's pretty clear that Luke knew that Paul died under Nero's reign, or at least his life was chopped off along with his head, and that this had happened. It's like he's sort of poking you in the ribs, but it doesn't make any sense unless you know that Luke knew Paul was dead. So same thing with some of his letters, like Philippians, just reeks with the knowledge that the reader knows that Paul is dead. And so here's someone writing in his name. But there's the similarity between Acts and the Roman novels seems to place it in the 2nd century. The Jesus in the temple thing in Luke seems to fit the tendency toward apocryphal infancy gospels and young Jesus gospels, which were being written in the 2nd century.
So on that note, so let's talk about the Gospel of John for a second. Mm-hmm. Because in the Gospel of John, it describes the pool with 5 colonnades. Now, the author of that text would have had to been in Jerusalem before 70 AD to witness the pool.
Not necessarily. I mean, you have later references in the rabbis to things in Jerusalem that were long gone, but they knew about it from tradition.
But this is one of John's topographical details that has been strikingly confirmed in the recent.
Well, nobody said he just made everything up. I mean, it's not unlikely he would have known about that. If he has the Jesus preaching in the portico of Solomon, it wasn't standing any longer, but Jews still knew about it.
Now, you also tell us that that the earliest readers and devotees of the Pauline epistles were the Marcionites and Valentinian Gnostics that you brought up before, and that we know of no Paulinus before the 2nd century Christians. But the writings of Ignatius of Antioch, which represents the see over there, Clement of Rome, and Polycarp of Smyrna, which represents 3 different independent centers of Christianity, support the writings of Paul in their letters prior to 140 AD.
Well, this is the same problem over again. Critical scholars for over 100 years have doubted that the Ignatian epistles are authentic. And there are various reasons for that, but you've got the same problem. And with First Clement, there's no name on the thing. It's anonymous like Hebrews. So we don't know, and we don't know when that was written, 60, 80, 90, hard to say. Polycarp, the martyrdom of Polycarp is filled with legends, certainly not eyewitness testimony. The letter of Polycarp, that might be it might be that that is by Bishop Polycarp, but it's practically quoting the pastoral epistles, and there are real good reasons for believing their 2nd century works written explicitly against Marcionites and Gnostics. There's a whole body of scholarship about all of this stuff, giving very detailed, voluminous explanations of why the authorship of the so-called apostolic fathers and even some of the later apologists are not actually by who is the names that appear on them, just like the Stoic epistles, just like you mentioned Augustine saying, if you don't accept the consensus of opinion about authorship of the New Testament. How do you know Plato wrote the stuff he supposedly wrote? That's a good question. There are pseudo-Platonic writings. There's a bunch of epistles of Plato that are rejected as authentic. Once somebody told me, well, more than once, if
Real quick,
you
Dr.
are,
Price, if I could just real quick, that was time for the 5-minute cross-examination for Jonathan.
okay, sure.
So if you want to just finish up just real quick, and then
No, it's okay. We can just go to the questions. I don't.
Okay. Do you have 5 minutes for cross-examining Jonathan too, if you like? Unless Jonathan, you're okay with going to the Q&A.
For closing statements, it would be first.
Closing. That's right. I'm sorry.
Well, I pretty much said what I would say a moment ago. You just can't be sure of these things, and the same skepticism inherent in the historical method does apply to all ancient writings. Not all of them are confirmable.
Okay. Well, Jonathan, if you want to use your closing time, you can start when you're ready. 5 minutes.
Okay. Once again, I want to thank Dr. Robert Price for coming out here and sharing his views on this. I do think it's an important topic to understand because, as Dr. Price details in his book, there wasn't just 27, but he's actually formulated about 54 texts that were out there that made very similar claims to apostolic teachings and writings from the apostles. So, when we look at this subject from a Christian perspective, how are we able to authenticate our Christian writings? Once again, the basis for this, and we're taking an objective standard, is based on the independent testimony. And while, Dr. Price may not agree with the establishment of the succession of bishops as a legal chain of custody for our text, we have the writings of Tertullian, who is witnessing to a polity that he's a part of. Irenaeus, who is part of the episcopate in Gaul and grew up in Asia Minor, is a witness to how the churches were set up and organized. Eusebius, himself, is also a witness to the polity. And while there's many different opinions that were shared by Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Eusebius, this is a position that they can empirically verify to show how the churches were actually set up. And when we look at all these different churches who had different theological positions, were constantly fighting with each other, and not all these independent churches accepted all 27 books, but the majority they did. And when we see that they have these lists, each of these churches, even to today, you can still go to any of these Greek Orthodox churches, the Anglican Church, Church of Rome, and they have these lists that go all the way back to the beginning. Were some of them forged? Possibly. Was there foul play? Possibly. But were all of them? And when we look at all these independent centers of Christianity, they come up with basically the same 4 Gospels. They name the same authors, the 14 letters of Paul, the Acts, 1 John, and 1 Peter. And how else do we explain that unless they do go back to the apostles? Whereas the textual claims of the Gnostics were all different. They did not have the same text. And with that is how we rule out. Just as the Jewish churches did not receive the apocryphal books in their canon, in the same way, these texts were not received by the official churches of the apostles. And with that, I close my arguments and pass it over to Dr. Robert Price.
Okay, Dr. Price, when you're ready.
I'm happy to go to the questions.
Okay. James, if you would like to take over for the Q&A.
You bet. So thanks so much to our debaters, and thanks Hunter for doing an excellent job. Thanks to the audience for bearing with us through those technical difficulties. You guys are the most patient people. Just totally love that you're here. And I love your questions. These are great questions. I think this is going to be a great time. And again, remember there is a giveaway where Dr. Robert Price will decide which question was best, which was toughest or most interesting. So we will have that book a giveaway of Dr. Price's. And I'm going to start just by reading the super chats, and then I'm actually going to switch back and forth with Hunter. So Hunter and I will be reading the questions off in back and forth. So with that, starting on the super chats, thanks so much. We really appreciate your super chat. I think this is actually a jab at me. I don't know. He said, the gentleman DV Cisco said, the word I used doesn't bother me. I grew up. Your PC is BS. I'm not really even that PC. I just asked why he was being so mean. Okay, Christopher, thanks for your super chat. Well, you can't please everybody. Christopher M. Hansen, thanks for your super chat. He said, history is not a court of law. I think that was probably for Jonathan Sheffield, if I had to guess. I think, if Jonathan, you have a chance to respond to that if you'd like.
So, when we talk about history, what is history? It's the study of the human past as it's described in the written documents left by human beings. And while history itself is not a court of law, how we authenticate the history of people is through their writings. So what documents do we have from a number of independent sources that basically come to agreement from the witnesses? And that's all we're saying in the legal argument. So when Augustine made that claim, how do we know where any of these things come from? And he basically establishes that the unbroken chain of evidence is a succession of testimonies that go back. And when we have independent testimonies that basically comes to agreement, this would, be valid in any other court of law, because this is what they do in normal trials. They have to bring in documents. The provenance of those documents have to be established. In any court, that is what has to pass pre-trial hearings. They bring in documents all the time. The provenance has to be established to enter it into testimony. And when you have independent witnesses confirm the testimony, that becomes conclusive. Courts deal with these issues all the time.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. So with that, we will start with the actual question, or I could say the standard questions. And with that, we actually had a person email his question in. Karag Nightwolf is a huge fan, so namely of Dr. Price. So he said, Dr. Price, I'm a big fan. Thank you for all that you do. What would you believe the reaction of Peter and Paul would be if we brought them back to life today and they saw that Jesus still had not come back, and that in fact the world had become more divided and confused when it came to spirituality? As we know, they wrote letters from jail to the faithful asking them to remain strong in their faith of Christ's return, for it was soon to come, and not to give up faith.
Well, I think it would be probably the same reaction Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, followers of Harold Camping, and many others offered when their predictions for the second coming fell through. They would say, well, no, they didn't. Christ did return, but in an invisible spiritual way, in one idiom or another, that they could not handle the cognitive dissonance of having to admit they were so wrong about something. So I'm guessing, they would have had so much invested in the belief that they would simply have reinterpreted it, as many other people in the same boat have done, spanning the end of the first century on into the 21st. So that would be my guess, just kind of rationalization and spiritualization of a gross embarrassment.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And then Hunter, you have
All
the
right.
list in front of you as well.
Yes. All right. So from Manifold to Dr. Price, what is your opinion on a Marcionite gospel priority, including his group, having a hand in writing the epistles to Paul?
Oh yeah, I think that some of the epistles, like probably the chapters 4 through 6 of Galatians, may actually have been written by Marcion, and the whole business with Paul going to Jerusalem for the approval of the bigwigs there, and they're granting that conditionally if he would financially support them. That may be a kind of masking for what happened when Marcion went to Rome seeking to be recognized as bishop, and made a huge charitable contribution to try to get him to sway them, though it didn't work. So I think he may well have written that. I think there are Marcionite elements in some of the others, like some of Romans may go back to him or to other Marcionites. I think some works in the Pauline canon, like Colossians, simply are Gnostic works. The apologists try to hide this by saying, well, yes, it's filled with Gnostic terminology, but Paul was just using that in an ironic way, trying to turn their lingo against them, which, if he did, had to be the most confusing tactic ever. It seems to me much like Occam's razor, but sounds Gnostic. Quacks like a duck. It probably is a duck. Um, I think that oh. I don't know that the Thessalonian epistles have enough of a slant to determine where they came from. I think the pastoral epistles, First and Second Timothy and Titus, are from the emerging Catholic Church, with taking shots at Marcionites and Gnostics. I believe Ephesians may have been originally Marcion's epistle to the Laodiceans, and that as Joseph Hoffman has shown, it may have been redacted into its present shape. I go into all of this stuff in the pre-Nicene New Testament, as well as in my the third volume of my work, Holy Fable, the Bible undistorted by faith. And it seems to me there may even be some Simonian Gnostic material in Romans. First Corinthians seems to me to be a patchwork quilt, part of it written by Gnostics, part by anti-Gnostics, because unless the writer was a multiple personality disorder, you've got a debate within the single text, one writer against another, I think. So I think they're definitely, well, there's certainly Marcionite material in the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John as well. I think Marcionite material is sprinkled throughout the New Testament.
You bet. Thanks so much. Then we have a question from Christopher Hansen to Dr. Price. In your book, Deconstructing Jesus, you argue that there could be a parallel between Baal and Jesus. However, the leading studies on, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing it, Baal or
That's correct.
Baal as a dying, rising deity by, in parentheses, Medinger, quote unquote, the riddle.
Yeah, Medinger, yeah.
Oh, Medinger, thank you. And then quoted the riddle of resurrection, and by Mark S. Smith, quote unquote, deal of death of the dying, rising gods. Both acknowledge that we have no evidence for this outside of Ugarit, and that the evidence in Ugarit is scant and debatable at best, and that there is no conceivable way to connect the vegetative, cyclical gods to Jesus. Because the chronologies and circumstances are so different, and the ritual purposes have no equivalent in Judaism or Christianity of the time, How would you respond to these studies that have, by and large, dismissed this parallel as basically non-existent?
They're wrong. That's how I respond to it. And in Deconstructing Jesus, I go into some detail responding to Jonathan Z. Smith, who is sort of the leader of the parade, trying to put to rest the dying and rising God model by outrageous special pleading. And in fact, the evidence from the Ugaritic texts and others have made it all the more clear that Baal died and rose from the dead, like Tammuz and Hercules and Osiris and Adonis and Attis. There is, for some reason, this attempt to say that, well, the differences are greater than the similarities. That's just willful obscurantism. Somebody does not remember what an ideal type is. The dying and rising God mytheme does not claim that all of them simply had Xeroxed the same myth. They all have certain basic important similarities that make it very difficult to deny, in my opinion, that there was a whole bunch of perhaps related, perhaps spontaneously parallel dying and rising God myths connected with religious ritual, and that you can even find it in Ezekiel, for instance, where we have the women of Jerusalem mourning Tammuz, who was one of the dying and rising gods. So I just think that is wrong, and it's part of the apologetic retrenchment that for some reason one sees everywhere in New Testament scholarship these days.
All right. So I'm actually going to go to the next question, and it's from T Jump, and he asked for Dr. Price, if Jesus did not exist, why make up the fable of the sentence / born in Nazareth, unlike the prophecy of being born in the house of David / Bethlehem?
Well, because different Christians were trying to explain why Jesus was known as Jesus of Nazareth, and others, and yet was born in Bethlehem. Why would they not call him Jesus of Bethlehem? And if you didn't have the Bethlehem thing in Matthew, certainly you would have assumed Jesus of Nazareth was born there. So Matthew and Luke, in strikingly different ways, are trying to harmonize these two things, so that Matthew has Mary and Joseph living in Bethlehem when Jesus is born in their home. And then they have to perhaps 2 years later, because of what the wise men say, they have to skedaddle into Egypt into safety. And then an angel tells them after a while, look, the coast is clear, go on back home. And then he says, oh, gee, actually, come to think of it, Archelaus, Herod's son, is in power. He's worse than his dad. Maybe you better not go back to Bethlehem. How about Nazareth up north in Galilee? So, okay, they do that. But in Luke, Mary and Joseph live in Nazareth. And while she's pregnant, they go to Bethlehem because that is the city of David, and Joseph is supposed to be a descendant of David. And while they're there, Mary gives birth, and then they go back home to Nazareth. Of course, there is no attestation of such a census, and no census ever required someone to register for taxation in a place they do not live, but where their ancestors lived 1,000 years before. So it's both are contrivances just trying to harmonize these two originally independent guesses as to where Jesus must have been born.
Thank you very much. Next up, Tom Jump asks, question, let's see.
I think that might actually be the same question. It's just copied on there twice.
Oh, thanks so much. I appreciate that. You're right. Jim Majors has a question, which is, please ask Dr. Price, on a scale of 1 to 99, how sure are you the historical Jesus never existed? 1 being not sure at all, and 99 being something you'd bet your house on. Thank you.
Oh, I'd say ultimately 1 or 2. There's no way to know. Though I think it seems to me the evidence certainly points in that direction, but it's insoluble. So I remain generally agnostic, though I think the burden of proof is on someone who would say, oh, yeah, we know Jesus existed. I don't know that he did or didn't.
You bet. Thank you.
All right. And from Christopher Hansen again, for Dr. Price, what is your opinion of the works of Bruno Bayer, I believe is his name? And he says I'm
sorry, could you spell the last name?
Bauer.
Oh, Bruno Bauer.
Bauer. Yeah, sorry, I butchered that.
Oh. I think he was really a pioneer in the Christ myth theory and the fictive origins of the whoops. Am I still on there? I've got some advertisement from Zoom on the screen.
Oh yeah, we can
You're
definitely.
fine.
Everything's good.
We can still hear you.
Oh, okay. I guess I shouldn't try to get rid of this. I don't know. Anyway, let's see. Bruno Bauer was the first to argue that the historical Paul wrote none of the epistles attributed to him, that if you look carefully, they are filled with inconsistencies and anachronisms, and that they, well, I don't know if he said this in particular, but an insight that agrees with that. Critical scholars don't think any of the truckload of documents, apocalypses, acts, gospels, epistles, and so forth attributed to Peter are authentic. I know fundamentalist apologists will fight to the death over 1st and 2nd Peter because they're in the canon, whereas 3rd and 4th Peter and all these other things are not. So there you can throw them to the wolves. Most scholars would say, no, he was a big name and people wrote in his name to get their ideas listened to. Well, why should it be any more incredible that people did the same thing with Paul? In fact, the Pauline letters occasionally warn about that and say, you know, people are writing letters under my name that I didn't write. He's saying that people were doing what Bauer said they had done all over the place, and which apologists deny. Oh, nobody could get away with falsifying a Pauline epistle. Well, read the Pauline epistles. People were doing it. And Bauer was the first to offer arguments that I think were superseded by W.C. van Manen and others who believed that Paul wrote none of these letters. So I have great regard for Bauer's work. I've only read one in English, Christ and the Caesars. He wrote valuable, long, detailed arguments about the Gospels and the Pauline epistles, but they're all in Dutch or German, and nobody wants to hear what he had to say, so no one has translated them, though I'm working on getting people to do so. So Bauer's a hero of mine. Don't agree with everything he said, but very important figure. In fact, I would suggest reading what Albert Schweitzer said about him in Schweitzer's book, The Quest of the Historical Jesus. That gives us a real good idea of what Bruno Bauer was about.
You bet. And we actually just got a super chat from Christopher M. Hansen as well. Thanks for your super chat, Christopher. And he says, thanks for answering my question, Dr. Price. Not a mythicist or agnostic. And then in parentheses says, I'm a historicist. Historicist?
It's a toughie.
Thanks. Is it historicist?
I think that's right.
Okay, thanks. But he says, but I love your work. So thanks so much.
Well, I'm glad. I do not try to make disciples. When asked, I will account for my opinions, but I have no interest in people becoming Pricists. I just try to Yeah, it's good. I just want to stimulate thought and discussion by providing perspectives and information interested people may not be familiar with, and let them do with it as they wish. I want, I'm happy to have people build on what I have done or to refute it. Go to it. So I appreciate your appreciation.
Excellent. And then I'll kick it back to you, Hunter, for the next one if you got it there.
Yeah. Okay. So the next one is from Nick J, and it's for Jonathan. Would you agree that Second Peter was a book that was highly debated to be included in the canon, as well as Revelation of Saint John?
Yes. Let's start with Second Peter as first. And this really demonstrates that the independent apostolic churches weren't just going to accept anything. So when we look at Second Peter itself, there were some questions as to whether or not it was from Peter. Now, we do have testimony from Origen that does support it. And what Eusebius writes is, even though it's one of those that were questioned, he said most of the independent apostolic churches came down with that writing. That writing was handed down and that was received. And this is confirmed in the Council of Carthage list. It's confirmed in Athanasius list, and in the independent churches they did. Now, John, obviously, there was a lot of concern about John. Bishop Dionysius of Alexandria disputed it. We know that the Greek Orthodox churches don't actually read the revelation of John in their liturgies. That's why it's not seen in there. It's actually only for private study. Obviously, in the Peshitta, it did not come down. But once again, the churches of John that Tertullian speaks of, which are actually Paul's churches that John took over afterwards, independently witness to this text. Obviously, we understand Eusebius's hostility to the revelation of John. Pope Boniface was against it. And a lot of the concern of John's revelation was it was too Jewish. So, once again, when we look at the independent witnesses that were recipients of the text, a majority of those independent witnesses that have lists that can trace back independently verified that it came down. And that's what the Council of Carthage responded to Pope Boniface, who was the Bishop of Rome, on Revelation, is that this text has been received by the fathers to be read in church. And that was what made it canonical.
You bet. Thanks so much. We just had a super chat. Christopher M. Hansen said, this is, I think, for Dr. Price, and what you guys were discussing just before. He said, I'm working on translating 2 of Bauer's works. I'm curious if, Dr. Price, if you could tell us who Bauer is for both myself and the audience.
That is mighty good news if you're working on translating those books. Bauer was a kind of radical Hegelian. Not that had much to do with his New Testament scholarship, as far as I'm concerned, but that probably did draw his attention, draw him to the attention of Karl Marx, and it's Bruno Bauer's Jesus mythicism that probably resulted in the Soviet Union making mythicism an official dogma of the state, incredibly. But he was very conservative politically, ironically, Bruno Bauer was. And he believed that Jesus had been created by Mark the evangelist, and that what he was doing, well, he said that the Gospel of Mark was a kind of a product of Romanized Judaism, or as we might say, Hellenistic Judaism or diaspora Judaism, and that he said that Seneca had said that it behooved any moral person or one who wanted to be moral to choose an individual or create one who would be a kind of imaginary conscience personified. And so that if you're thinking of doing something dubious, you'd think, gee, what would so-and-so say if he caught me doing this? And he said that's what Mark intended for his Jesus character. And indeed that comes, it's almost prescient of the way even today Christians say, what would Jesus do? Of course, it's not a bad idea, right? Whether you believe there was a historical Jesus or wasn't, how would I feel if Jesus came strolling into the room and said, Price, what do you think you're doing? Yeah, that's a good idea. But that's what he thought the origin was, and that it caught on and became literalized. And fascinating character and great biting sense of humor. Schweitzer quotes a bunch of the cracks he makes. He's vituperative about ridiculing differences and contradictions in the Gospels. Well, I love the Gospels. I wouldn't take that approach, but he had a great sense of humor, as Schweitzer himself did. So I can't wait to read those translations of yours.
You bet. Excellent. I would just do a couple more super chats. Did you get those super chats that came in, Hunter? If you want to read them, you can.
Actually, I did not get them, so
No problem.
I'll take the questions if you want to take the super chats.
You betcha. I'll read these off really quick. Brian Stevens, thanks so much for your super chat. I think it was just a gift to the channel. I didn't see a message, but if you have a message you meant to attach to it, just put it in there in the chat, and I will read it off. So thanks again, Brian. And then Brian G, thanks for your super chat. He said, cracking good show. I don't know what that means, but I think it's good.
Yeah.
And, and then he said, took a jab at his rival of standing for truth. I can't read it out loud, but we understand you guys have a rival, and thank you for your super chat. So go ahead, Hunter, kick it back to you.
Awesome. Okay, so for Dr. Price, do we have a good justification to not believe what the Church Fathers said concerning the canon? As in, is there a way to prove the Church Fathers as unreliable? Which I think is actually a good question.
Well, I think so. Just reading Irenaeus, his blanket appeals to the elders of the Eastern Church on various items it's hard to believe they ever discussed, like dealing with the alternate reading of in the book of Revelation, when it gives the number of the beast. Most manuscripts say it's 666, but some say it's 616, and I think Irenaeus opts for the 616, but at any rate, whichever one, I'd have to look it up again. He says the Asian elders are all behind me on this. I doubt that seriously, and a number of other things. He just invokes these unnamed groups of elders, and it seems to me it's or how about the thing where Jesus was nearly 50 when he died. He died in the reign of Claudius, and everybody in the East knows this. I doubt that seriously. And there's and Eusebius and some of these guys, the stuff they accept as authentic, like the epistle of Abgarus to Jesus and Jesus back to him. He says, Eusebius says, I found this in the church archives at Edessa. Come on, no, you didn't. It's obviously spurious if you look at the contents. Or, in my opinion, though there's no time to go into this, Eusebius is the one that wrote the famous Testimonium Flavianum mentioning Jesus in Josephus, and somebody else interpolated it in there. I don't think these guys were really interested in history so much as writing stuff that would legitimate the party line in their day, as people are still doing today. But at any rate, if you look at a great book by called The Idea of History by Collingwood. He explains the difference between what he calls scissors and paste historiography and scientific historiography. Traditionally, going for hundreds of years back, historians were mere chroniclers. They looked at all the documents they could find, and they just took all of them at face value unless there was a contradiction, and then they would have to flip the old coin and choose which one to accept. But they looked at the documents as what they called authorities, whereas modern historians look at them instead as sources, making the assertions of any ancient text, Bible or anything else, justify themselves. They have to be corroborated by other evidence. And if there are inherent improbabilities, you can't just swallow it. And he says you have to keep in mind there is a history of propaganda, so that what you don't think is historically true is there for a reason. And if you look at enough of those problems, you can tell there is an agenda going on. And I think, unfortunately, apologists are treating the patristic sources like fundamentalists do the Bible. If it's in there, I believe it. And how come? Well, these guys are Christians, they wouldn't lie. That's completely circular. There are loads of pious frauds and still are.
You bet.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
Awesome.
Sorry,
And-
Hunter, it was your sorry, it was your fault. Your turn.
Yeah, so final question, and it's for Jonathan. Would you agree that Eusebius combined reality with fiction or distorted a few things in his works?
Well, he was a big fan of Origin, so I wouldn't put too many things behind him. But you know what? Obviously, there's some things that we can look at. But if you think about it, what does Eusebius tell us when he speaks to the scriptural canon, which is really the subject that we're discussing? So what was his approach? Was it different than any other historian from the ancient world? And what he tells us from his writing, he says, at the beginning of the work, I promise, when convenient, to quote passages in which the early presbyters and historians of the church have transmitted in writing that which had come down to them regarding the canonical scriptures. So when you look at that baseline, now obviously, Eusebius is allowed to have opinions, as Irenaeus did, as Tertullian, but he had a firm foundation because he was going to the ancient documents. Yes, he had his own personal views on Revelation and some of the other documents, but he had a firm foundation on what he was establishing for his sources. Even on the question on the letter by King Akbar that Dr. Price was talking about. Now, if you look at it from a historian perspective, he went over to Edessa and found these documents. And now what Eusebius doesn't say is whether or not the document that he's referring to is authentic. It's not. But in the role of a historian, that's what he's doing. He's collecting documents for his history. So good or bad, it's a good historical investigation. He does have some opinions that I personally don't agree with. I understand his context behind, Revelation. The Pope at the time didn't like it either, as well as the Bishop of Alexandria. But he does, even though he had a soft spot for Origen, who's probably not my favorite father, but he does come in with a firm foundation of collecting historical documents, like any historian should do, to base the testimony on.
You bet. And as Hunter mentioned, that is the last question. Those are a lot of really interesting questions. And with that, we will close with the book giveaway. So, and the good thing is, even if you don't remember the name, Dr. Price, if you remember maybe just a keyword from one of the questions, I've got the list of the questions, so I can just do Control F and search for that keyword and narrow down which question it was.
Well, I guess my favorite would be where do you rate the likelihood or how sure you are whether Jesus existed or not?
You bet. That's Jim Majors. I remember that one. So that's a really interesting question, and that was the one that, for those of you who forgot, asking how certain are you of his non-existence on a scale of 1 to 100. 1 being like not sure at all, and 100 being so sure that you'd bet your house on it. So thanks for that question, Jim Majors, and we will mail that book out right away. So. Also, Jonathan Sheffield, I was going to ask, did you guys forgive me, did you narrow down the title of the book? I forgot the title of it.
The Incredible Shrinking Son of Man.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. So with that, I want to say thanks so much for these debaters being here, putting forth such a, I'm always honestly so thrilled that we've got like kind of people that are going to these primary sources and really just digging in deep. And I know the audience loves it as well. We've just got a ton of positive feedback. And so I want to say thanks so much to the debaters just for being here, for being so civil, for showing people that we can disagree and still be respectful. So really appreciate both of you, Jonathan and Dr. Price, for being here.
Yeah, you're great guys. I appreciate being invited.
It's been a pleasure. So.
Oh yeah, no. Thank you for everything. I think Dr. Price, has a lot of really good research. He definitely makes really good arguments on some points. So I think definitely, Christians, non-Christians alike should definitely still check out his works and understand the arguments that are out there.
For sure. And just a reminder to everybody, everybody's links are down in the description. So both debaters have their links in the description if you want to check out more of their content. And in addition, Hunter's link is down there too. So Hunter, I want to say thanks so much for helping moderate tonight. Totally a blessing to have you. And thanks everybody for your questions out there. Really interesting. And with that, have a great night and keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care, everybody.